Into the Aftershock. Pretty full crew here tonight. Alex Morgan, Robert Jonas, and the man with the plan. It is his season, Colin Etnire. Good to have you guys here. What might be our final show of the year? I mean, unless some big surprise comes in or some reason to all jump back on. But I hope everyone has a great holiday season, and we'll say maybe more about that at the end of the show and kind of reflect back on 2023. But let's get this kicked off. The Quakes announced on Friday a number of pretty big decisions. It felt like the biggest, meatiest update we've gotten in terms of a roster decision set of decisions in probably 2-3 years. Colin, you're the man who this is your time of year. You live for this stuff. I'm going to kick it off to you. We're going to get into the details, but you're just very first when you saw it, like what stuck out at you the most?
Well, there's a Football Manager, the popular management video game that you use to manage rosters. Especially if you're going for a lower league team, you know that those contract expiries at the end of the year, that's kind of the valuable time to start making moves, because it sets up everything else you do. It's the time you're basically setting the table for what your next season is. And we talked a little bit off camera right before this about why exactly executives do that. But this is the time you prepare yourself for what's coming. And that means you're going to take some hard decisions, and they let a lot of people go. They declined a lot of options. There's a lot of contract expiries in there. It's going to clear a lot of space. And actually, if you look at it, the current roster, actually just pulled it up in front of me a second ago. I think I counted here that they have 8 senior slots unfilled on the senior roster right now. And that shows you like how thoroughly the decks have been cleared. That doesn't mean, of course, and we know every year that just because someone had their option declined doesn't mean that they won't return to the club. Tommy Thompson has come back after that. Judson came back this year after that. But it really, is a big deck cleaning. They swept out a lot. This was, it's not entirely unexpected. There was a couple of names that I was perhaps a little bit surprised were on the decline list. And maybe even some I was a little bit surprised to see that they were on the option picked up list. But overall, the scale of the clear out wasn't surprising, in part because this is the end of Lucci season 1. Lucci had one preseason to work with the guys and could make a couple of moves about what he thought. And he certainly had watched the team, and watched their film and kind of understood what he was walking into. But you really don't know your guys and your roster until you have a year of them playing under you. And so I think that this is a reflection of, okay, Lucci has had a year to evaluate this roster. Here are some, given the options that are available to them, this is what they chose to do. So I think that it's not unexpected that after the year 1 is the big clear out rather than before year 1.
Jamon, if you ever wonder why Colin is able to deliver such sober, level-headed analysis, it's because he's made every single one of these decisions and run through every single one of these scenarios like 6 or 7 times in Football Manager.
That is absolutely
true. He's already been through it all.
Well, we don't know that Chris Leach isn't doing the same thing. Maybe Chris Leach has done it 10 times in Football Manager.
I would love to see how many hours each Major League Soccer general manager has logged in that game. That should be included on the Athletics GM survey next year. That'd be good.
That'd be good. Robert, you didn't get to join us for the year-end show. You've been through, my goodness, how many of these decisions? Like, where did this one kind of rank just in terms of, as Colin mentioned, a bit of a deck clearing? Do you recall one, at least in recent years, where you felt like it was potentially as impactful to the future roster state as the one that we saw this past week?
I think, like Colin mentioned, I think what impressed me the most is how many of the bigger names are in that now, on the way out, or maybe they're trying to renegotiate with, and including on the DP side, which I think is an important with Jamiro Montero, for example. I think it's an important step. Most of the players on the I think there was 23 folks that are still considered, on the full roster. A lot of those are the homegrowns, players that they're going to keep. They're not cutting the homegrowns left, right, and center. They did get have a few options decline, but just players that you could be penciling in your regular match day 18. We're seeing a few of those leave, and I know we'll talk about them. But a player like Miguel Trauco, I think, is a really important name to bring up. A name we didn't see a lot in terms of field presence last year, but Nathan, a player that was expected to be the rock and the center of the defense, again, option decline, not necessarily done with the Quakes, but, in a position where now, they're probably talking to him about what kind of contract they can agree to. So those to me are significant, and in terms of big house cleanings, yeah, I think with a first year done with Lucci, he can kind of look at guys and make those decisions. Chris Leach, this will be his kind of getting into the middle of his tenure as the full-time GM. These are important decisions for him to make. If he's going to be looking for his own contract extension in the near future. So I was impressed. I was impressed that they were willing to make some of those cuts, and a few of the players they kept, maybe a little surprised. I think we'll talk about a couple of those. Like, Benji Kanovich is an interesting name for me. But overall, yeah, I think it's some sound business.
All right. And Alex, you had some feelings in terms of particularly, I think the loan situation is one that maybe you were eyeing up there a little bit. Matthew Hoppe not coming back, at least not under the current deal that he had. It also looks like they're walking away from Ayo Akinola, but Rodriguez looks like they are executing that option. Was that the biggest news for you in there, or was there something else in there that stuck out to you?
Well, I think the biggest things that caught my eye were the decision to not renew on Trauco, the decision to not renew on Hoppe in Montero. Those are probably the three players who had the most impact last season, who are not currently salaried for the San Jose Earthquakes for 2024. Now, when I first saw those announcements, I was thinking, wow, this is a pretty big cut. This is pretty bold from Chris Leach. Good for him. He's looking for a pretty big overhaul heading into 2024. At the end of the season, we talked to Luchi Gonzalez, and he said they only needed a few adjustments, a few tweaks for the next season. But this is more than just a few adjustments and a few tweaks. Now, there is a pretty big asterisk there, and that asterisk is that some of these players might still be returning. As you said, Matthew Hoppe might still be returning if they can figure out a new transfer deal for him. Jamir Montero might still be returning if they get him on a really favorable contract. Miguel Trauco might still be returning if they can get a salary cut for him. So there's ongoing negotiations that are happening. This is not the final say for any of those players. I think, until you get official confirmation that they're elsewhere, these still could be kind of open negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, some important points for those who are, new to MLS, and everyone's kind of referred to it. And just because an option is declined doesn't mean that a player can't come back next season. It typically means that the club would like to try to get them on a more favorable deal to the club. In the way that MLS roster mechanisms work, there is a bit more power in the hands of the club than there are the players. The free agency, much more limited than other sports in the United States, for example. In fact, Jamiro Montero doesn't even qualify for free agency, although Jonathan Mensah does, and the club said that he will be entering free agency. But it takes a good bit of time in the league to be able to get that ability to do free agency. So there is something coming up called the reentry draft, and there's also a bona fide offer that was extended. And Colin, I'm going to look to you, because one of the players that I think all of us felt good took a big step forward in 2023 was Jack Skane. Unfortunately, his momentum derailed by a couple of injuries at different times, but he was a recipient of a bona fide offer. And I'm going to look to you to try to help us through, what is the point of a bona fide offer to the extent that you can explain it, and what does that mean in terms of the reentry draft and player rights and things like that?
Yeah, basically the bona fide offer, it's a very mechanical process. So it doesn't mean there was a tribunal that decided that the offer was bona fide. It's actually just a number. So I believe it's 30% above their previous salary, and it's basically a mechanism to ensure that clubs aren't holding a player at the club against their will, without extending them a real offer to play, for that club. Now, of course, 30% above the previous season's salary doesn't necessarily equate to fair value. Clearly, Jack Skane believes that he's better value than 30% above his previous season's salary, which is fair enough, by the way, because his salary last year was 88 grand, which is, I'm not saying that's bad money for a mid-20s kid to be making, but, in MLS terms, that is like a very back of the end reserve roster. So add 30% to that, that's just over 100 grand. He probably thinks he's worth a bit more than that. And so, I think that's fair enough. But basically the MLS mechanism is you put this offer in, and it's similar to a qualifying offer in baseball, just at a much lower rate that's kind of indexed to the original salary of the player. So that qualified offer mechanism is basically just to make sure that a player isn't trapped without a contract at the home team. Therefore, that kind of allows them to retain his MLS rights. Anyway, that being said, I can't imagine that they aren't trying to look for something decent for him, to bring him back. Partially because, and I've said this before, he's kind of an odd player in his playing style. He would not fit in every single system. Some players, you can comfortably say they would fit anywhere just fine. I think that, he would have to, if I'm him, if I'm his agent, I'm saying we got to look for a situation where you're going to fit well with what they do. He doesn't qualify for free agency yet. So I'm sure that he's going to do his best to kind of find the right thing for that. But it's a purely mechanical thing that you shouldn't read too far in. It's just the Quakes basically doing their part to reserve his rights.
Yeah. And so, we will see how that turns out. Hopefully there'll be some announcement that we will get coming down the line here, ideally before even the end of the year, that they've come to terms, on a deal. And of course, at any time, players who are out of contract or had their option declined, I should say, we could really hear at any time that they've also been signed to a new deal as well. Alex, looking like you're biting to say something there.
You're saying that pretty dispassionately, Jamon, when I think there's probably no player I feel stronger about than Jack Skane and bringing back Jack Skane.
Oh, absolutely.
Right now, if they don't bring back Jamir Montero, this team has no other player who can play in that 10 position reliably on the books. They're most likely going to be, I think, getting rid of Montero and getting in like a DP level number 10. That's something that we've been talking about for ages now. But that's a risk, right? That's a risk. And a player that can perform there and who is one of San Jose's best players at the end of last season should be brought back, right? He's making 88 grand. And I don't even think Colin did it justice. That's like fourth lowest, I think, on the entire San Jose roster right now. That's behind a lot of the kind of homegrown players that haven't even seen first team minutes ever, like the 17 and 18-year-olds. So he deserves a significant raise, and the Quakes need to bring him back. And that's something I feel pretty strongly about.
Okay. And then, Robert, you referred to it. So before we got this announcement, we actually got a different announcement, which was that two players, Paul Marie, Benji Kanovich, were signed to deals. I think, Alex, you and I might have talked a bit about this because someone from the MLS media side had, I think, already mentioned that they were both getting new contracts or something along those lines. For sure, Benji, and I think we knew about Paul Marie as well. But officially announced Paul Marie, Benji Kanovich coming back. Robert, you found maybe curious that they made the decision to bring Benji Kanovich back. I had heard he actually had signed mid-season on a new deal, and that kind of injuries kind of derailed him most of the rest of the way, minor injuries and such. But talk about those two signings, and because clearly they have a lot of confidence in Paul Marie if they're declined on Miguel Trauco.
Yeah, and I think that going back to even Lucci's comments about adjustments, if you look at who they kept and who they dropped, you've got a decent amount of the starting lineup still under contract. From the goalkeeper, Danielle, you've got, Rodriguez now signed, which I think we should spend a little more time talking about because I think that's a huge signing in terms of, getting your center backs squared away. Paul Marie made a lot of starts and had a lot of effective minutes for this team. I mean, we were, we talk about him on the Aftershock show quite a bit of post game, and in his way of influencing the game and being able to play both the right and the left hand side. If they're looking at him as a full-time starter, I think that's an interesting adjustment. I still think he's a role player for this team, and can spell on either side. So, Trauco was someone I think was more reliable for the squad. With Benji, it was a tricky one. A player that didn't have the productivity this year that we saw the year before, and I know there reasons are varied for those. Does feel a little like a gamble, or perhaps maybe a little more as keeping an asset that you have in your column. I do want to talk eventually about Colin's point about flexibility when it comes to caps. The one thing the team has yet to really capitalize is on transfer money and the GAM you can get from that. And Benji may be the kind of guy you're holding all around to maybe get some of that if you don't feel he's going to be a field product piece. So if that's the case, then maybe it makes sense. If it's and if they got him under a good contract, again, it still makes sense. But he doesn't really kind of rate highly on the list, or at least it doesn't feel like the kind of player that you're looking at to make a contribution this year. Paul Marie, can't argue with that. I think that's a great deal for this team.
Colin, I wanted to talk a little bit about Miguel Trauco's situation, because first off, maybe you have a perspective about outside backs and their value in this league. It's not uncommon for teams to try to move on from pricier outside back contracts. There's a general perception that as a position, they are the lowest value position on the field. And so Miguel Trauco, at his age, on a contract that was $550K last year, in some ways, it's surprising to see his name, mentioned here, because it wasn't really something we discussed. At the same time, $550 is a lot of money. Is this probably a price consideration? Do you think they would love to have him back if they can get him back on a deal that is closer to what his value is at his age, for an outside back in MLS?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I'm quite confident that they would they probably are, as we speak, trying to bring him back on a lower number. One interesting piece of context, though, is Carlos Etnire, who's on the other side, plays the exact same position and is a touch younger, but not significantly younger, and on the exact same salary, was brought back on an option. And by the way, I'll take one brief zoom back second here for table setting for option season. One thing to keep in mind for option season for everyone who's watching tonight, the options are by definition larger than their previous year's salary, and sometimes can actually be quite a lot larger. And in fact, there's a kind of ongoing legal action in Europe about what is legal for an option to be. In Europe, generally, an option must be significantly more than a previous year, because otherwise it's considered unfair to give team control over a salary in that way. So MLS options have historically been less of a bump than you'll see in Europe, but even some of them are quite large, and they're built into a contract, particularly for longer ones. Like Benji Kikanovic had a contract that was a rolling set of options over many years, and it had a bump in it. And the idea is, if we're still activating your options in the middle and later years of this contract, it means you've already kind of established yourself in the first team. So we're going to index your salary to that. So anyway, that's just important context for looking at this. Is we're not, Miguel Trauco, Carlos Etnire, whatever, all these players, you see their options exercise. We're not necessarily going to get the exact same salary next year. We know it's going to be a little bit more, could actually be a lot more. So it's just one thing to keep in mind. We won't know until, usually late April, when the US or the MLS Players Association releases the salaries, exactly what they got them back on. But that's one of the things that makes this particular roster announcement harder to analyze, is we actually don't know the size of the options that are declined. We can just kind of guess that they're, say, 10 to 15% over the previous salary on average. So anyway, yes, that means that Miguel Trauco is an expensive fullback. It means that, Etnire is an expensive fullback. And I do think it is very valid to say that it is one of the lower positional values, probably the lowest positional value on the pitch. And in a salary capped league, then that means that you have to be very prudent in the resources that you use for them. It's interesting that they made the decision that Etnire was valued for it and Trauco wasn't. But I do think that's probably a valid choice to make. Etnire was rock solid all year long, very consistent in his contributions, and played both sides of the ball well. He was contributing on defense and attack, and he's a touch younger. And so I think that they were confident that he would kind of keep up that level of production. Trauco, getting into his 30s, very good on the ball at times, but there are some weaknesses in his game. You know, he was not always a strong defender, and he doesn't have that same kind of pure athleticism that a Capo does. And so I think that there was kind of perhaps a worry that his game wouldn't age as well on the other side.
Alex and Robert, I'm going to get to you just in 1 second. Mike's got a good question here. Bonuses aren't included in the salary info, right? And publicly, that's correct. MLS.
Well,
yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I may. So there's something called total guaranteed compensation, which is what you do see in the MLSPA, and that does include certain types of bonuses that are considered more or less guaranteed. There are incentivized bonuses, say, for example, scoring a number of goals in a season. Those will not appear in their salaries. And at times that has led to big gaps between what you can see in the roster and which not. But in MLS, it's not heavily incentivized contracts the way you'd see in, say, the NFL, which has highly incentivized contracts. So, I think we can safely disregard bonuses for the purposes of this conversation.
Go ahead, Alex.
Well, I was just going to say that I think the problem with letting go of Miguel Trauco is that he was the most reliable player on this roster when it came to delivering top corner bangers. And the Quakes don't have any other player on the roster who can deliver with the same consistency.
Yeah, I was going to say Paul Marie had one or two.
Top corner bang. Not last season. Paul Marie historically has had bangers, but I think he was underperforming his expected bangers.
Expected bangers?
Tally last season. So that's an open question. And it's possible that Miguel Trauco had some contract bonus for how many bangers he put in the top corner, and that put his salary over like 700, 800K, Colin.
So very well, maybe so. I will say the other. I'll do one more piece of table setting here. So I told you that I at least as far as I can tell, there's 8 senior roster spots that are completely empty right now. The number of cap resources that I estimate, and by the way, I've done my best to kind of bump the salaries from the last year to kind of get an approximation of what those bumps and their structure would look like and their options. We're talking somewhere on the order of $3 to $4 million of GAM plus TAM plus salary cap resources for them to use. They're fairly fungible. They're not completely fungible resources, but between the 3 of those things, you're talking $3 to $4 million to play with for those things. So off cap is the U22 program and the DP program. Everything else has to kind of come from that $3 to $4 million in terms of salaries and including amortized transfer fees for any of the remaining players. So that is quite a bit of space to work with, but it's actually not a ginormous amount of space to work with. And the big move would have to come through those off-cap mechanisms, i.e. a U22 or a DP program. But it does mean that there is a lot of space there. And I did kind of mock up in my little salary spreadsheet. I have what I call a sandbox tab. You can easily fit 3 U22s, a replacement DP from Montero, and bringing Montero back on a TAM salary, as well as having Miguel Trauco in there. And on a reduced salary, all that fits within the resources that I'm currently aware of and does not include any extra resources that you might gain if you have, for example, a Cade Cowell sale.
Colin, random question. Have you ever heard of an MLS club giving out a really long contract so they can amortize that transfer fee over a long period of time? Is that ever a weird?
Yeah, this is the Chelsea FC thing that is imported over from the American systems. So, and the NFL is particularly infamous for they actually now design contracts to have intentional years that are never intended to be exercised in order to amortize signing bonuses over them. I have not heard that system being used very strongly yet in MLS, and I believe it's because they can't void the years in MLS the way that they can in NFL. So basically, like the whole boat guaranteed contract salary has to be guaranteed in that given year. So if you're adding an extra year, you're adding a full year of guarantees, whereas in the NFL, you're adding a year that is a non-guaranteed year. And yes, you can zoom it up at that point, but to my knowledge, that particular tool doesn't work in the MLS toolbox.
And I think because of the way that the DP is structured, I think the most you can amortize is 3 years anyway. So I don't think you can extend a DP contract amortization beyond the first 3 years of the agreement. Now you can pick and choose where you put the money in what year, but you have to amortize the whole thing over 3 years.
Thank you. I could have Googled that, but when you have two people with encyclopedic knowledge of Major League
one's
Soccer.
deep in the CBA.
Got it.
So let me throw this around to all 3 of you. Let's have a little bit of fun here. You can bring back only one player out of those that did not have their options exercised. And let's go through the list just so everyone's clear on everyone who's in this list. So it's Oscar Agren, Nathan, Keegan Tingy, Miguel Trauco, Cam Seeley, Judson, Jamiro Montero, and Tommy Thompson. You can only bring back one. Which one is it? And what's the salary that you're bringing them back on? That would be,
well, by the way, Jonathan
Mensah
salary. And Jack Skane also out of contract. Not
technically, yes.
Declines. Yeah, sorry.
Yes. But let's focus on the ones that were technically declined. So the ones that I mentioned there, you can only bring back one. And what is the salary that you think they should come back on? So let's just test a little bit of our knowledge of MLS salaries and things like that. And Colin will keep us kind of honest from the spreadsheet side. Robert, let's start with you. Go ahead. Who are you bringing back and on what salary?
I do think what we saw from Nathan in his healthy time on the field, and if he's passing his medicals, he makes a ton of sense to bring back for me. And then Skane would be my second choice. But I want to focus on Nathan because he's the player that if you bring him back and he's healthy, he and Rodriguez are going to be your starting two defenders. And now you've got Beeson on the bench to back the two of them up. He's going to probably need to be a pretty decent TAM salary, and I don't. You're going to test me on numbers. I don't have the number. I'll let Colin.
Anything over 650 is going to be TAM range at least.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised
if you can't buy him down.
Given his age, I think that would be not a given, but with the injury, that might mitigate it, and you might be able to get him back on a smaller salary. So he proves himself, and if he does, then he's going to get his bump as you go further forward. But I think that would be a tidy bit of business. I would have said it was imperative if they hadn't picked up Rodriguez, but that also doesn't make this a luxury signing. I think the Quakes still need to really have a concrete back line to continue any progress that they might have made this season.
Alex,
all right,
you bringing him back? What's their salary?
I'm going to have some fun here. And Colin, at any point, feel free to jump in and tell me this is completely wrong. This can't happen. The one name you didn't mention was Matthew Hoppe, because they did not exercise his option to purchase. As far as I'm aware, that does not preclude them from negotiating a new purchase with his club. Okay, hear me out here. I think they should negotiate a purchase for him around a transfer fee of $1.5 million, 3-year contract, $500,000 cap hit a year. And I believe this would probably only work if he's still considered under 22 initiative. He was for last year. He is now 22. So I do not know if he still qualifies. If he does, that means his contract only have $100,000 cap hit, $600K a year. I think that's a good deal for Matthew Hoppe, but that might not work, Colin. You might be telling me that doesn't work.
It's an interesting idea for sure. I like it.
No. I like the idea as well. I actually literally had this exact conversation with somebody in the front office and over the summer. My reading of the rules indicate, well, basically the U22 contract has to be signed in advance of the season or during the season in which you turn 22. So that means that it would have had to have, if they were going to get a U22 deal done for Matt Hoppe, it would have had to have been a part of the agreement that was signed in June. And it couldn't.
So a player can stay on U22 beyond 22.
Correct.
You're saying that a new agreement would make it so it resets the clock in effect, and
unless I'm reading this wrong,
no longer eligible.
Yeah, unless I'm reading this wrong, and I didn't get a strong pushback in the conversation when I was having it, I don't believe that a new deal would be eligible for the U22 program. Which, by the way, Alex, is the same bummer. I feel the same. I think it's a bummer. It's like we can go deeper in the Hoppe thing in a second because I think it's worth a full round. But yes, the U22 status is what is the difference between that deal making sense and not making sense, and so you really have to kind of fit it in there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad,
Alex, it was so interesting.
Experiment.
Yes. So you had the thought experiment. Let's set it aside. Let's come back and revisit it. Take somebody else off the list that we know can fit into the salary situation in a valid way.
Sure. For me, it's Trauco. He was reliable last season. Lots of bangers. If you can bring him back on a contract that's roughly equivalent to what they were paying him last year, I think that's worth it. I like having 3 fullbacks who you can slot in at any time you want. I think that rotation worked very well. I think that was the one area of the field that I never complained about last season. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So Trauco is probably the easiest one for me.
All right. That makes a lot of sense to me. Colin.
I didn't think I'd be the only one saying this. Maybe I'm going to be way out on my own here. If you can get Jamiro Montero back on 700, you do it. And it's, to me, it's, I think, well, it is something that happens kind of subconsciously for everybody and very, very consciously for me, just because of the way that I think about soccer. We always evaluate people in reference to their salaries, really. Jack Skane has been an awesome player on a minimum salary. But if we were paying Jack Skane $500,000 a year the last couple of years, I think people would be complaining about him because they'd be like, wait a second, we're spending a lot of money on a guy who's, only appearing here and there, right?
He's good and he's injured.
Right. So like, look, I always say like happiness is a function of expectations, and expectations are set by how much we're paying people. Jamiro Montero was on 1.3-ish last year. That's a lot of money. And that's too much for the value that he was bringing on the field. But he's still actually a very good player and someone that the Quakes don't have a skill set like his in the roster. And I don't think it's particularly easy to find a replacement for him either. If he's on a TAM deal, it becomes much more palatable. And I think that 700-ish is about the right number for it. I think that his ability to hold on to the ball in the middle of the park is something that not a lot of other Quakes have. I think that he gives you the ability to do certain things that Lucci would like to do. I think he's the most valuable player on that list in terms of, like, again, if you take all salaries off, if they were all given to you for $0, you'd probably pick Jamiro Montero of that group, because I think that his skill set is less easy to replace than Miguel Trauco, who I like, but you can find a left back who's adequate at a much lower number, much more easily than you can find a guy who's comfortable in the middle of the park at an MLS level. So for me, Jamiro on 700.
Here's an interesting question for you, because personally, I don't want any shade thrown towards Jack Skane. I think he well deserved $500,000 a year based on his performances last season. You might be thinking about it as a general manager. I might be thinking about it more as like a coach, because he was the one player every time he got brought on the field that was raising the tempo, that was lifting the team, that was bringing joy to the field. And that was very, very, very important. And here's the key thing for me. He's 25 years old. Jamiro Montero is 30 years old. So if you're going to bring a player back, on a 2-3 year deal, I think you choose Jack Skane. I think he has significantly more growth left in him and, career left in him than Jamiro Montero. So all else equal, I'm actually taking Jack Skane over Jamiro Montero in that situation.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stick with the declines because I think Skane's its own separate conversation. I think there've been some very good arguments here, and I like that people think a little bit differently. For me, I'm very concerned that Montero has lost a step, maybe even more than a step given last season. And I think at 30, I'm concerned at anything over 500K for him, because I think that decline might be happening and might be happening in a rapid way. So I think that's my one concern with Jamiro. I think it's more like 500, maybe 600, but definitely I wouldn't go into TAM range for him given what I saw last year. I think anything less than that, and it's replaceable. I like Miguel Trauco right now, and I for the same reasons I think that Alex does, and I like him on around 300. I probably would go as high as 350. For me, I think having no concerns about the outside backs, you got 3 outside backs, 2 of them which can play either side. That there are going to be international call-ins and all kinds of things going on, particularly with Copa America happening next year as well. So for me, Miguel Trauco, but probably on about half of what his current salary is, maybe just a touch above that. So that's where I sit. Now, Colin, you wanted to kind of circle back on the Matthew Hoppe. Why don't we do that right now? Tell us a bit of what we do know about the Hoppe loan situation. If you have any guess at all in terms of what the buy, or just, finger to the wind, what it feels like you think the buyout, from Middlesbrough would have been and things like that. And then, having him on a U22 was attractive. And that would be one of the reasons that you would probably go ahead and pay an expensive buyout, is because, well, you can keep him on a U22 through what? 25 years old, I think it is?
It's about 3 years for him, yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, that's kind of a key decision. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, look, this is by far the most opaque thing for us to kind of dig into in the salary spreadsheet, because there's so many unknowns. We don't know the value of the buy option. We also don't know the value of the salary that Matthew Hoppe would have accepted in San Jose. Because, by the way, whatever salary that we were paying him in San Jose was negotiated between San Jose and his host club, Middlesbrough, not with Hoppe directly. It's possible Hoppe would have said, you know what, I want way more money than your fraction of my salary that is getting paid from Middlesbrough to stay around, because this is a smaller league and I want to make it in Europe. It's also possible he would have said the opposite, and he would have said, you know what, I am willing to take a pay cut in order to, to get more game time back in California, where I'm from. So there's so many unknowns on this that it's really difficult to kind of fit it. I also don't know that, as I said, the reason that this is so complex is the plain reading of the rule would suggest that he was U22 eligible at the time the June contract was made. If the buy option is executed as a part of the June contract, does that mean he's still U22 eligible, or was he always going to roll over into a non, U22 eligible? I don't know. These are like the most arcane questions that, quite frankly, could probably only be answered by the people in the league office and the MLS Players Union. I would say, I would wager that his transfer fee, and by the way, the one thing is that for loans into MLS from outside leagues, there must be a buy option. It's just a league rule. And so they always set a number. Options to buy are always set above the market value of the player, or at least in general, unless they basically the clubs have already decided to do the transaction. And the reason why is fairly obvious. It's like, you don't want to, set it at a market value, and then the player plays really well, and then the loaning club gets all the upside, or they play poorly and they don't exercise the option, and the loaning club takes none of the downside. So it wouldn't make sense to set it like right precisely at the market value unless you basically already arranged for the transaction to go ahead. So I would actually wager that the option sat maybe at 2 million or something a little bit on the high side, 2 to 3 million, which would have been pretty rich. Maybe it was a touch lower than that. But if it's $1.5 million and, he's making $500,000 a year ish, the amortization of the transfer fee is $500,000 ish. You're talking $1 million a year cap hit that comes from TAM and from the salary cap. And that's a lot. I'm not saying it's definitely a no for me. He was a very valuable player down the stretch, but that's a lot less valuable than if you take all the transfer fee off and you take a lot of the salary off the salary cap via the U22 mechanism. So I'm actually left with kind of a different question here, which is, why did they structure this transaction in this fashion in the first place? Because basically, if you're ever structuring a transaction in an ideal environment, if you're the buying club, you want to be able to participate in some amount of upside from the transaction. So that means you want to be able to, if it's successful, you want to be able to exercise an option and take advantage of that. If it's unsuccessful, you send him back to his club. So be it. This, if it's structured in this manner, if it's structured in a way that the transfer fee was way too high for the club to accept, if the U22 wasn't an option, it's kind of hard to imagine that his actual play on the field didn't achieve exactly what they were hoping for. So if it achieved exactly what they were hoping for, why did they design a transaction that was not exercisable 6 months into it? The only answer I can be given is that they basically viewed him as cover, just pure cover. They needed numbers in the front. They needed somebody to potentially score some goals. And they were out, they were desperately seeking it. And that was a very convenient, low cost, low salary cap hit option for them to do so. If so, that's kind of a bummer. It makes some sense. I'm not saying it's, like obviously cover can be an important thing, but it's kind of odd to me. I would much rather have, if I'm in that front office, I'm trying to design a transaction that, if it goes really well on the field, allows me to kind of carry that forward and take advantage of that upside. And that's not clearly what happened here. If he had a bad season and they declined the option, whatever, we don't know anything. But the fact that he had a really good season and he looked like he was a fit and the auction still wasn't worth it, that seems kind of odd to me.
Colin, that was a very eloquent way of crushing my dreams, but at least I now have somebody to blame. And apparently that person to blame is Chris Leach for structuring his contract that way. So
but without Chris
Leach,
Alex,
direction for my frustration.
Well, and by
Alex,
the way,
without Chris Leach, you would have never had the dream to begin with.
And by the way, we have no idea. So by the way, I'm saying, Chris Leach didn't structure a transaction that allowed them to participate in an upside, which to me indicates that he just saw it as cover, which is fine. That does provide value, and it came at fairly low cost and low risk to the team in order to provide that cover. And he was valuable for a couple months there, that other players wouldn't have gotten. What we don't know, as I said, are the two things. We don't know what his selling club would have demanded. And it might be quite a lot. It might have an expectation that is way out of whack for him. And we don't know what he would have demanded in salary from the Quakes in terms of his contract. It's possible that both of those things got totally out of whack.
All I'm hearing is that nobody believed. Nobody believed like I did.
You're the only one, Alex. You could, but you should. What I'm struggling with is that Tommy Thompson is with Almeida right now in Greece, and you're not there. So
yeah,
there's that as well. Robert. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. What do you say about Matthew Hoppe? You didn't get to join us on the season-ending show, so your thoughts now, both season-ending, like how did he do, and then, what are your thoughts in terms of declining the line?
It's always interesting. I really enjoyed his contributions. In terms of he was a good player down the stretch. I found it interesting when they did sign him or brought him aboard, and they brought in Akindola. Roughly at that same time. It just felt like, these were a couple pieces that were kind of half on trial, half they're available and they can play if we need them to play. I'm not surprised by Akindola being, basically, they're not going with that transfer. This one just, seems like if he probably has, that high level, kind of, English football tax associated with his transfer where they're not going to let him go cheap. And so it was never going to be easy in the first place. And so maybe he outplayed his ability to be signed by the Earthquakes, unfortunately. So at least we got a couple of good months of seeing him. And, unless he's the one kind of pulling the levers behind the scenes and wants to transfer to MLS, I just can't imagine there was any number that was going to make that possible. So, enjoyed his time here. I thought he was really productive. I'm not sure he's the guy who's kind of mold the offense around, but he certainly is a player that you can count on offense. So, mixed feelings there. Alex, I'm a little with you. I would have loved to see him come back. I thought he fit this team really well, but it's a salary cap league and probably not going to happen. I don't know if you want to continue with Hoppe, but I do, you mentioned Tommy Thompson, and I think that's actually a very interesting discussion, with respect to his longevity, his tenure with the club. I was there on the dirt where the stadium now sits when he signed his original contract, and we were looking at just a few pieces of steel in the background there. In a sense, he's pledged himself to this team, but, he hasn't, his opportunities have been rather limited, and I wouldn't blame him for looking to see if he could make one last splash somewhere as well. Another player that I'm sure if the Quakes made a reasonable offer and no one else did, he's probably going to take it. But I don't know if the Quakes even kind of look at it that way as well. Do they need a Tommy Thompson on this team moving forward? Given his productivity, I'd just be curious what the rest of the group here feels about him.
Alex?
Yeah, I think Tommy has been a servant to this club for a long time. I think he's the only player still on the books that was on the team when I started covering the team in 2015. I think he's the last holdover. And he's always been a pleasure to talk to. I think he's represented the club very well over that period. I think it's pretty clear at this point he's no longer a player who's going to be contributing significantly to the first team. But with that said, it's always important to have veteran players in the locker room who've seen this club when it was coached by Dom Kinnear, when it was coached by Matias Almeida, when it was coached by Mika Stare. Who's seen the club through its various iterations. So I think I wouldn't mind him sticking around on a very, very cheap kind of salary that put him at the bottom of the roster. I think the question for Tommy is does he want to try to stick around MLS? Does he want to go to USL, where I'm, sure he'd be able to make a pretty big impact and, be a starting player at that level? Or does he look for an out? Does he look to go into coaching or into scouting? Does he try to join Matias Almeida's, setup in Athens? Because he wouldn't be the first player to do that, right? Daniel Vega is now a part of Matias Almeida's staff. He kind of slowly accumulates players who he's played with. And, if I think Tommy Thompson gets a really solid, option that allows him to transition into a coaching role or a scouting role, if I were Tommy Thompson, that's something that I would consider at this stage of his career. So all of that's to say, I think a kind of low offer might make sense for him, but it's clearly not something that the Quakes are going to stake the 2024 season on.
Colin, add on anything here that you want about Tommy, but it's interesting to me that when you already negotiated someone like Tommy and also Judson onto a new deal, that you wouldn't structure it in a way that you could easily keep them around for 2 years and get back in this position and potentially have to do another negotiation. I found that a bit curious. Like, I would thought that probably they would have set those deals up in a way that they would be easy options to just take for depth in this team. But Chris Leach being pretty aggressive here to decline options a year after he had declined options on them already.
Yeah, well, Judson was on $300,000 this year, and I don't think he provided $300,000 worth of value. And so the option, as I said, by rule, options have to be above the number that they are before. So, I think that what you do is you write that option in there, and if Judson, returns to form and contributes a lot, great, you exercise the option. If he doesn't, fair enough. I mean, options are just leverage. So I don't mind, coming back to the well over and over again if that's necessary. The Judson, Judson, I think, is a clear thing there. There's also the thing. Look, one thing that's in the background of all these things is, remember, we're talking about human beings here who got their own preferences and their own ideas and their own, what they want in this world. In the front office, we'll have a good understanding of that. And there are times when your interests are very strongly in keeping a player against his will. But a lot of the times they're not. And so they're going to understand where these players are at and what they want. So if Tommy was desperate to stay in San Jose and wanted to take a minimum salary just to be on the roster and to be part of the group and to be a good influence, they probably would have accommodated that. But maybe Tommy says, you know what, I really want to get regular game time day in, day out in my career, which I've never really had before. I'm going to play for Sacramento, my hometown club. And spend, and by the way, he'd probably make at least as much money in USL as he does here in MLS, but he'd be able to play every week, in his hometown. That's pretty cool, right? Maybe that's what he wants to do. Maybe he wants to go to AEK and, link up with Almeida's staff. I don't know. So I would say a lot of these things, there's kind of an element there of, we don't really know what's in these guys' minds, and we don't know what their preferences are. Montero might have said, I really want to stay in San Jose and I'm willing to take a pay cut. Or Traco the same, or Traco say, I'm done here, I'm not renegotiating, who knows, right? So I would just say that that's the toughest part of guessing on this season, is that you really do, there's a huge element of what the player wants that affects these decisions, and that the front office will be much more familiar with their states of mind. And so if they decline a player who they like, usually it means the front office understands that there's an appetite to renegotiate.
All I'm saying is, if he goes to Sacramento, that would put a lot of fire in the Open Cup rivalry between
it'd be fun
and Sacramento. That'd be a fun one.
All right. Anything anyone wants to add on Judson? I feel like he's one of those players who, man, he had so much. Colin, you once wrote that it really was all about Judson back in those early Almeida days in terms of
that first Almeida year. Yeah.
In terms of what was making the system work and the turnaround that it went through, a lot of that was on him. He had that ability to go side to side, be able to stop counterattacks, which was critically important in that particular system. That type of range and that kind of license to be able to move in the defensive midfielder position does not seem to be something that is interesting to Luchi Gonzalez, nor would I say that Judson has the range that he once had, right? So is there a price that you would bring Judson back on, or do you think this is probably the last we see of Judson?
Well, so actually, this actually to me gets to a bigger, more interesting. This touches on a broader issue, which is there is a literal value. Like everyone has a number, right? Everyone there's a number that everyone makes sense at. Um, but in practical terms, if you're having a guy on the roster that's still a roster spot and it's still a human being in your locker room who has some amount of expectations about what they're playing, and a coach who may use a potentially slightly washed up midfielder to kind of provide cover, when if he doesn't have that guy available to him, he's going to have to reach towards a youth prospect, for example. So there's actually a value, even if, like we say, that there's a number at which Jutsen makes sense, and even if it's a number that Jutsen wants to accept, because again, like maybe he wants to go back to Brazil, maybe he wants to maximize his earnings in some other way, who knows? There's actually a value in clearing out the space for other players to grow into the space. And sometimes it's very difficult for the young players, even if they do have the potential to exceed the person who's in front of them. Sometimes it's really hard for them to kind of take that space unless they're given the opportunity to do so out of necessity. And so I think that some of these things, you're going to see names clipped off, even if their numbers might make sense at a certain number, just to generate space on the roster and kind of invite other people to step up and say, hey, here's a spot, go grab it. Michael Baldissimo is at a very different number than Jutsen is. And, he's on a minimum salary. So you're not expecting necessarily the same level of production, but you're saying, hey, for a late in the game, side-to-side coverage or occasional spot starter, Jutsen played that role for us at some point. Take that role from him. Don't double down on that. So I'm actually the unsavory phrase that they use in English journalism is deadwood, getting rid of the deadwood of the roster. It's not necessarily the high salaried guys. It's actually just creating space for other players to occupy it. And I actually think that the Quakes kind of have an overabundance of, young players who are kind of fringy and guys who I'm not even 100% certain are definitely MLS quality guys, but they kind of need a little bit more space to grow into it. So I'm not a big fan of, keeping middling kind of mediocre players in order to have a decent player in that spot. I'll give you one random example here, by the way, is, and this might be something that's indicated by the options and declines that we saw. The under 18s player, the academy player that I think is the most ready for first team soccer is Oscar Verhoeven, who's mostly been playing right back for that team. He might not be the highest potential player in the academy. I think that most people agree that Cruz Medina is the highest potential player, but from what I've seen, Medina is a little bit farther away from being a first team contributor. Verhoeven kind of looks like he's ready already. So if you have too many fullbacks, you have, for example, a Tommy Thompson who's been doing, playing at MLS level for years and can put in a shift. You're probably not going to go to 17-year-old and probably 18 by next season, Oscar Verhoeven. Now you have to. And so you're basically saying, like, all right, step up, guys, like young guys, who's going to impress me, sink or swim. And there's a lot of people who kind of have a philosophy of youth players, which is, they do tend to sink or swim, and that's an indicator of whether or not they have the mentality to play. I love that the chat loves Oscar Verhoeven. I think he's a really nice player. And as I said, the thing that's so impressive to me is that he's 17 years old and his game is actually very mature already. Like it's fairly well accomplished. Whereas Cruz Medina, I would say, probably has some years to go before he reaches the level that he wants to.
It'd be quite interesting if one of the reasons that they felt they could decline, at least on Miguel Trauco, is to be able to make the space for Verhoeven to get some time next year. Maybe he becomes the third fullback, on the roster. That could be a very, very interesting.
Yeah, I see the Tommy Thompson
idea.
decline is a more direct linkage to Verhoeven than Trauco, just because otherwise that means they don't have any left-footed fullbacks, which is probably not ideal.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. But one thing to just kind of tie that in and then maybe get everyone's thoughts on this is, one of the things that Chris Leach doesn't seem to be afraid of, that it did feel like Jesse Fioranelli, for the qualities that he had, he was very big on trying to create a roster that kind of felt like a family. And I thought sometimes didn't make tough moves that he should have made, because he almost felt bad declining an option or telling a player that, a young player, that they weren't good enough. for that, Chris Leach doesn't seem to have that problem. Chris Leach seems perfectly fine to sign a homegrown or to sign someone in the draft, and then the next year just go like, sorry, declined. So if you take a look at these moves, Agrin, Tingy, Silly, I'm trying to think, was there another one in there? But they did decide to extend on Baldissimo, Buddha, Richmond, and Daniel Muni, but there's some cuts in there. And I remember the first time someone remind me the name of the center back, that young center back that was a homegrown that got cut
Casey Walls?
last year. No, Casey's still on the roster. I'm thinking
Jacob Akanyo.
Jacob.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Jacob is the first one that got basically cut, and now we're
Gilbert
starting to
Fuentes
see
as well.
Gilbert Fuentes, but Gilbert was.
Yeah, they gave him years.
Yeah, there was other issues there. So, but just but there's a couple more cuts here as well. So young players who potentially have the ability to be able to become something, but willing to say, you know what. I think after the first year, we didn't see enough progress. We're going to open up that space for another young player to move into, maybe another draft pick, another, homegrown to be able to move into. So, there is some interesting, cuts here in terms of young players as well. Anyone want to, add any thoughts on the young players that were
before we go to the young players, I agree with you. There is a ruthlessness there. Ruthlessness is very important for a general manager. They effectively, in a weird way, general managers are investors. They're trying to acquire assets, at below their value and utilize them at above their value. You can't, if you allow sentiment in, it gets to be a problem. Jesse had a bit of a weakness for this. His predecessor, John, his predecessor was much worse. There was a lot of sentimental contracts handed out in the John Doyle era. So this is a welcome thing, and I think that to the extent that all four of us know Chris Leach, it does not surprise us that he has more of the ability to be ruthless when necessary here. And I think that that's a really important trait, and that's something you need to have.
All right, people again bringing in a lot of love for Oscar Verhoeven. I think you hit on something there, Colin. People definitely have enjoyed what they've seen with him with Quakes 2 and are looking for him to get the opportunity to move up. So maybe this will be the year. Anyone else want to weigh in on young players, homegrowns, draft picks, any of the other cuts that we got to see? If not, we'll start to move toward final thoughts for tonight.
Yeah, not a cut, but Nico Shakaris was under contract clearly, and a player that was on the ascendancy. I'd be curious how the folks here view his potential role in maybe some of these decisions. I don't think he's a like for Jamiro Montero, but he is the kind of center midfielder that you're trusting more and more. You see him head up with the ball and able to kind of take command at times in games. Is that another reason to maybe decline Jamiro and maybe try to see if he wants to come back for a lower contract, knowing that he's not necessarily going to be that kind of impact player for this team?
I think yes. I think while we're on the topic, the other thing that I find is interesting that hasn't been brought up is the Jackson Ewell option to renew, because that was something that was mentioned a couple of times throughout the season last year, that if you're really looking to clear house, he could be a player that you try to move for an interleague transfer fee or a trade, because he's one of the guys who's been around for a long time and you might be able to upgrade on. So the fact that Jackson Ewell was renewed, I don't want to pretend that was always going to be a given. The way I see it is that they wanted the consistency in the midfield with Jackson Ewell, so that they can, get Jamiro off the books. I think that the fact that Jackson Ewell was renewed makes me a little bit more confident that Jamiro is probably on his way out.
Yeah, you made a good point, Alex, because we focus on the declines, but not so much on the contract options that were pickups. So just to be clear, that is Carlos Acabo, Daniel Muni, Michael Baldissimo, Jackson Ewell, Aseni Buddha, and Will Richmond all had options that were picked up. Colin, Robert, either of you want to add anything on to those particular options that were picked up, and your thoughts of on those players?
I mean, I was a bit surprised with Will Richmond since he's been very far from the first team. Not as surprised in Nusini Buddha, who I think is a bit closer to the first team and probably has a bit more upside. Akapo, we talked about before. The only reason it was a touch surprising is because it's a big salary at a lower value position, but very solid performance. So it's hard to argue with that. The Ewell thing, I don't think is related to the Montero thing, because I think that they just see them as tactically very separate players. And you in an ideal world, you want like a good version of Montero and a good version of Ewell on the same field, and that's kind of the going rate for a good central midfielder. So I don't mind that at all. And I've also been probably one of the foremost Ewell defenders on the league. Now, I actually don't disagree with Crystal and Arfie here on Will Richmond doing well on Q2. What I would say is one thing that people should probably do is go back and look at the actual ages of the people that we're talking about here, because I think that there's this idea that all these people are young, that some of these guys are not as young anymore. And I mean, they're still young men, but Paul Marie will be 29 next season. That's not exactly a young guy anymore. Jack Scan will be 26. Not, that's certainly still in the middle of his career, but it's not like he's a youth prospect who's unproven. Will Richmond is 24, Michael Baldissimo is 24, Daniel Mooney is 24. Those are fairly young in MLS terms, but in European terms, 24, 25, 26-year-olds, those are mid-career guys at that point. And MLS has a really good history of later developers. Obviously, most famously, the greatest late developer of all time, Chris Wondolowski, didn't really break through until he was 27. But those are generally the exception rather than the rule. And the American development model is very different than it was at the time when he's there. Yeah, Marie's turning 29 this year, Arky. Seriously. My point by making this is just, time comes for all of us. Some of these guys that we have in our heads as youth prospects, because they haven't broken through yet, they're not necessarily kids anymore. And so for me, Will Richmond as a 23-year-old and at the MLS Next Pro level should be performing really well, because they're the Oscar Verhovens of the world. There are 17 that are starting week in and week out at that level. So for me, and Silly and Tingy actually looked pretty good at the Quakes 2 level as well. But again, they were older, and so you have to kind of evaluate them against where they need to be in their development pathways. And so I would say that a lot of the guys who are cut versus the guys that are retained, it's the guys who weren't developing enough. Usini Buddha, he's going to be 24 next year, but they felt like he has the upside to keep going. And that makes sense to me. So I think that being a little bit ruthless and saying like, once you're into your mid 20s, you kind of have to like really shown us you deserve a roster spot. I should also add they have a ton of guys signed to the first team 24, not 23. So there we go. So the guys who are signed to the first team who are on first team contracts who are not on the senior roster is a very large number last year. So there was far more guys on those contracts than even could fit in the supplemental and reserve rosters. And what that means is you have to either non-roster players altogether, which is not necessarily a great solution except for the very youngest players, or you have to send them out on loan. And so I actually think that part of this is just like they wanted to create space on the supplemental and reserve rosters.
And a name we haven't really talked about, Daniel Mooney, who we didn't see him very often on the field, but he made a good impact in his debut, and maybe you end up with another Tanner Beeson type player on your roster, a player that is reliable, but maybe not building your defense around, but someone that you don't get terribly upset about having available to put into the field. So I thought that was a pretty good pickup. Yeah, I do too.
Our impression is the club
I like him too. I think his upside is higher than Beeson's. I think we know what Beeson's upside is at this point. I think his upside is higher, and I think they'd like to see if he can achieve it or not.
Yep.
And Crystal says Mooney was great in Quakes 2 also. And you want to know anything about Quakes 2, see Crystal or anyone in that supporters group, because they're there every game for it. Want to try to wrap this up. We are a little bit over an hour. It is late on the East Coast for Colin, and I appreciate that. There are a couple questions here which are looks ahead to next season, or not necessarily relating to this roster. There was a comment about JT. I just want to be clear. JT already had a contract for next season. There was no option. He's not in an option year. So it wasn't a question as to whether they brought him back or not. He's on a contract. However, the good chance is that he will be out all next season, or a significant portion of next season, at least. Do you think that they make the decision to, go with a Emi Ochoa, or do you think that they go pick up kind of an MLS backup, maybe look in the draft potentially for a decent goalkeeper? Where do you think they go from here? Let me start with Robert on this one. Robert, what are your thoughts on the goalkeeper position?
Every MLS offseason, you get a few guys that have some experience that are available. Look no further than former Earthquakes players that we've seen play between the sticks over the last couple seasons. And I think that's where you see the Quakes try to make a low money savings contract, is to find that third keeper. Maybe see JT put on to whatever the equivalent of injured reserve is at this point, if they don't feel that it's legitimate that he's going to come back. And even if he does, and you have Daniel playing there, you don't really have to have him come back in 2024. So yeah, they'll probably wait to see what other teams are doing and what other players might be available in that backup range, and that would be a tidy bit of business at least you could do.
Alex?
Can you bring Tommy Thompson back as a goalkeeper? We've seen him play everywhere.
It's possible. He needs to cover every
role
position in the league. It's
he plays next
important.
Season.
Yeah.
I think it's a no-brainer to bring in a solid keeper with MLS experience. Everybody who I talk to that watches Emi Ochoa regularly is not convinced that he's ready yet to be the backup keeper. And I think it makes sense to bring in somebody who you can be confident in. So you might be able to get, if you're able to get like a top, 2 or 3 keeper in the draft, maybe you feel confident in that. But I think more likely they just go with an MLS veteran who's been around the block a few times.
Colin, anything there?
Totally agree. Emi Ochoa, remember, everybody was signed when he was 14 years old. They knew he was and goalkeeper, of course, is the position that traditionally develops the slowest of all those positions. So it's not surprising necessarily, but yeah, no, Ochoa, from what I've heard and from what I've seen, I don't think is like necessarily ready. Although some teams do like to scrimp and save on the backup goalkeeper position because it's a relatively low value position until it isn't. Of course, we know that there are times when your number one goes down, it can be very valuable to have somebody who's decent. But it's generally a lower value position. So I wouldn't be stunned if they just handed the gloves to Emi Ochoa, but I do think that it's a worthwhile place to kind of go for a reserve type keeper. And, it could be anybody. And I will say, I will repeat the story because we've heard it several times over the course of this show's history. But, the prior front office basically decided, well, we have Emi Ochoa around, so let's get rid of Drake Callender. And the current front office people were still a part of the organization. And I know to a man that they were not a fan of that decision. And it still kind of sticks in their craw that they sent Callender away for so little. That's apropos of nothing. It's, that is in the past, but it is something that kind of sticks with you. It's like, shit, that would have been really nice to have Drake Callender on the roster.
Yeah.
But it is hard, by the way, to have Callender and Marcinkowski and
Daniel.
If Callender had been on the roster, we never would have gotten Danielle.
They would not have gotten Daniel.
Right. So now that
but that might have been okay.
The sliding doors that have put us into where we are, I do think you just try to get a reserve. The MLS draft is actually not a terrible place to get a player of that dimension. Depends on who's in. I haven't looked at the draft this year at all.
All right. Okay, guys. Final thoughts, so we can let Colin get out of here. Alex, start with you.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We have a great audience tonight. Appreciate all of you for being so engaged and for pushing us on some of the deeper roster questions here. I want to wish everybody a happy holiday season. I don't know, unless we get like a major DP signing, this is probably what would it take to bring us back, Jamon?
A fourth DP announcement would definitely bring Colin back to talk about it.
Well,
So
what are they saying? They're saying what's the date for that?
I'm not coming back.
Some people are saying that in the chat, so I just thought
just because there's a slot doesn't get me back. I think that a DP signing is what it would take to get me back.
Well, if there's another slot, there better be some
DP
signings. So all that's to say, wish everyone a happy holiday season. Hope that everyone is safe and sound and spending lots of time with your loved ones. And yes, that everyone, if you are looking for a holiday gift for your friends and family, do we have a way to gift a Quakes Epicenter Patreon subscription, Jamon? Because people should be able to do that.
Yeah, Patreon is not really good for that kind of stuff. So I think they've added something more recently. There is the opportunity if people want to check things out to do the do the trial thing. Just let us know if you sign up for a trial, because we don't really get notified through the normal routes. And that way we can make sure that you get access to the Slack and can try out everything that you want to about the offering. But yeah, Patreon is not good for gifting stuff like that, unfortunately. But
okay. Well, I feel like this episode has been a lot of housekeeping, trying to figure out, okay, where we're at the 2020 end of the 2023 season. And next is the exciting part. Next is figuring out who's going to be that DP number 10, are they going to get that DP left winger as well? Where are they going to add to this team to make it significantly better? So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to 2024 and spending a lot more time with you gentlemen and everyone in the audience in the next year.
Robert?
Yeah, I echo a lot of that. Also want to kind of point out that, if we look at last off season rather, with Danielle coming in and Carlos Correzo were the two, the players that stepped into the starting 11. Well, actually, Danielle did not start into the step into it. He became a starter as he kind of became accustomed. So the Quakes will need to make at least one or two of those types of signings to make even incremental improvement. And I'll come back to talk about whoever Chris Leach is able to find for that. But one last shout out for both Nathan and Jack Scan. Want to see him back in Quakes Black and Blue next season. So Leach, I know you always watch to the end of the show, so do us all a solid and make sure both of those guys are signed up.
You think he watched past the part where we blamed him for the Matthew Hoppe situation?
Yeah, he understands. Just like
he wants to talk to you, Alex. Remember, you and he are supposed to have a nice little conversation. So I think you should bring that up.
There we go. Bring it up
on that one.
Bring back Scan and Nathan. Okay, there's a slogan in there somewhere.
All right. Well, so I want to wish everyone happy holidays. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight. Great audience for not announcing this until about 3 hours beforehand. And of course,
do I not get a last thought?
That's on me. I didn't you already have the last thought? Colin, go for your last thought. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness. No, it's totally
I'm
fine.
I'm a terrible host. Bring Phil back.
I'm gonna insist just to kind of give, I think that there's times throughout the season that I had a fairly dour, outlook kind of to offer fans, because they were a bit stuck in terms of their roster, and therefore down the stretch I was kind of giving, I would say a fairly sober estimate of what was going on. I want to change that narrative here, and this is why I interrupted Jamon here and insisted on my last thought. Look, this is Leach season 3. We're going into Leach season 3. We're going into Lucci season 2. That's when you would hope that your front office and your manager are kind of hitting their stride. I think that the first season for Leach, you could say that's a wash with the Almeida final season blow up disaster. And, Lucci in his first year, coaches do usually kind of, as long as they have a competent first year, you're not going to get on too hard. This is where you're going to, potentially watch them hit their stride. And I think that I actually have a certain amount of faith that they can. And a big clear out for the roster is the step one of that happening. That does not mean that they're going to make all the right moves to fill in the right gaps, to push the right buttons, to get the right roster that they want for next year. But this is the necessary first step. And it sets the table for, there's a lot of things open. They only have one U22 slot utilized out of 3 right now. And if they sell Cade Cowell, they have all 3. They'll have a bunch of GAM. They already have one designated player spot open. They have, $3 to $4 million in GAM, TAM, and cap resources to allocate towards things. they've set the table to enable themselves to make some positive moves. If they can make, and they've consistently made pretty good moves. I might go do a post-mortem on their moves, later on this offseason if I can find the time to write it up. But, they've set themselves the table to do something decent. And in a second year of a coach who now knows his players and knows what he wants to go do, and a front office that has a kind of an open table to put stuff on, this is where you could imagine them taking a leap from being a very mediocre team who's just barely squeaking into the playoffs to like maybe a serious playoff team. And so I have a certain amount of faith in that this offseason, so I'm excited to watch it happen.
Colin, I appreciate the role you play in the show because you're a little bit like the Undertaker. You kind of creep around the edges until, something has been finalized, something's finished, and then you swoop in and you give us the post-mortem, the last word. So we appreciate that.
Alex, I thought you didn't watch wrestling. We're going to have to work on this. Okay. All right. Again, happy holidays to everyone. Thank you so much. This is the end of our third year as a show. Of course, Colin started the Aftershock several years ago. Colin, what year did you start the show?
2015.
2015. And not the same original format. It was a one-man show back in the day, but we appreciate him, allowing us to use this, but really being able to bring back the Aftershock in this mostly post-game format. I feel that 3 years is a good start, but I think we've got some more in us. And a big thanks to Alex, to Robert, to Colin, and to Phil, who are our main crew throughout the year. Asher Cohn giving us always those radical thoughts in the chat, even though he's not on the show these days. And but hopefully, Phil, happy holidays to you. And he's in New York right now, doing what Phil likes to do, which is checking out Broadway productions. So hopefully he's enjoying himself. Otherwise, he would have loved to have joined tonight as well. But we'll be back next year, of course. And hopefully all of you guys will sign on for another year. But we'll talk in the offseason.
Where's my contract extension? Where's my option deal? I thought there was there's supposed to be significant pay raises in those.
Doesn't kick in until we get to 1,000 subs, Alex.
Yeah, that's a good one. Good transition.
Need to get over those 1,000 subs first. But I appreciate everyone. For everyone who's able to, thanks for hanging in there and contributing to the Patreon, even during the off season. That does go to help us defray costs coming into next season. Very important for us to be able to keep that coming in if you're able to. Of course, the Slack is always open. A lot of you are active in that. And we will be back probably in January as soon as we start to see new signings in. So, hopefully we'll be able to talk more about that soon. Real quick on the Patreon, if you are new around here, we do have a Patreon, quakesepicenter.com/Patreon or patreon.com/quakesepicenter. Either one of those, you can go there. $2 is the smallest amount. If you give that to us, it's because you like us, because, Colin and I will write articles maybe once or twice a year. I wrote 3 last offseason. I might go for 3 again. So we don't write articles all that much anymore because we got the show. But if you enjoy the show and want to contribute, that's a great way to do it. If you want access to our Slack, $5 gets you the access to the Slack, and then $15 if you just got a lot of money and want to throw more at us. We will definitely love to be able to come back and do another season of this next season. So looking forward to that. And with that, I think our show for tonight is done. Anything final, guys? We're good. Happy holidays, everyone.
Nice to see y'all. Happy holidays.